The envelope didn't look like much. No bold letters, no dramatic branding, not even a stamp that hinted at the wrecking ball inside. It slid across the edge of the kitchen table during a routine sorting of bills. Jenny almost didn't open it. After all, how many times can you pay the gas bill before it breaks your spirit? But something about this one paused her hand. And when she peeled it open, mid-conversation, standing on live camera, what spilled out wasn't paper. It was silence. Living biological daughter, location, United States. That was it. No context, no introduction, just data, cold and brutal. But for Jenny, it roared. Welcome to Reality Sport. I'm OLIVA, and this isn't just your typical 90-day drama. This is the moment Jenny finds out her past has been edited, and not by choice. What happens when a woman discovers her entire foundation was built on a lie? Subscribe if you're into real emotional transformation. And drop your thoughts below, because what's coming next will keep you questioning everything. That sentence didn't promise hope. It pressed reset on decades of grief she assumed she had buried correctly. Jenny wasn't childless, she was separated. There's a difference. One leaves a scar. The other never lets the wound close. She stood frozen, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. Sumit was nearby, watching, but somehow, the space between them didn't shrink. It ballooned. You could feel it through the screen. His posture said concern, but his eyes tracked that paper like it was a threat. And maybe it was, to silence, to comfort, to the version of love that survived thanks to things left unspoken. This one-page document didn't just break news. It broke the entire rhythm of their relationship. Because patience only works when you're unaware of what you've lost. And now, Jenny knew. For years, she lived with the narrative that the pregnancy was over before it began, that she should move on, that no child meant no motherhood, no mistakes to revisit, no what-ifs that needed answers. But suddenly, the story had a face she might never meet. And that changed what she remembered, what she accepted, and who she had become. If she was lied to back then, what else had she trusted for too long? Was the silence in her relationship supportive or strategic? What Jenny felt next wasn't shock. It was something much louder. Clarity. Years ago, the room had smelled like antiseptic and resignation. Jenny remembered the fluorescent lights, the slow nods, the way the doctor wouldn't meet her eyes. She was scared, vulnerable, young enough to still believe that authority equaled truth. So when they told her the pregnancy had ended, she nodded. Once. That was all it took to seal her fate. No second opinion, no phone call later, no paper trail worth keeping. Just a final sentence delivered gently enough to be accepted, but cold enough to never be questioned. She didn't fight. She survived. Back then, she thought survival meant acceptance, that trusting meant moving forward, that the pain itself was proof something real had happened, even if it left no trace behind. But now, sitting decades later with that DNA result in her hand, what Jenny felt wasn't grief. It was disorientation. Because everything she had believed about who she was, her timeline, her limitations, her identity, was based on a lie she didn't even realize she had permission to challenge. And once that lie cracked, the rest started to crumble. Like how she learned to live with unanswered questions in her relationship, how she trained herself to stop asking when timelines shifted, how whispers of someday replaced plans. The same way she was told there was no child, she slowly started accepting there would be no urgency with Sumit, no clear priorities, no solid next step. There was always love, but there was always waiting. Looking back, Jenny saw the pattern clearly. She trusted silence packaged as care. She mistook someone avoiding hard questions for someone protecting her from pain. The same calm demeanor that made that OBGYN seemed trustworthy had been living in her home for years, shaped differently, but just as hollow. What she called strength was just adaptation. She shrank her expectations so they couldn't be disappointed. She adjusted to vague communication so often, she forgot clarity ever existed. Sumit never yelled, never walked out, never belittled her directly. But he also never gave her certainty. And until now, she didn't realize how similar that felt to being erased. She'd always described him as gentle, honest, truthful. But what kind of truth demands you wait for years? Because that's the part that hit the hardest. If something so critical, like a child, could be withheld without her consent, what else had she signed off on without reading the full contract? Jenny wasn't grieving a child. She was grieving who she could have been. When Jenny read that letter, the one that split her world into before and after, Sumit didn't run. He didn't raise his voice, didn't deny her pain, didn't dismiss her grief. He stood still, listening, watching, silent, and at first, that looked like support, a calm presence in the middle of her emotional earthquake. But then nothing changed. No questions from him, no urgency, no initiative. While Jenny's identity was dissolving in real time, Sumit's biggest response was a hesitant, "We'll figure it out." A sentence that gently placed the burden of figuring out squarely back in her lap. It wasn't new, it was their pattern. Every time something big loomed, whether it was marriage, moving, timelines, Sumit didn't reject those ideas. He didn't object, he absorbed, he delayed. He let time blur the edges until the threat passed or Jenny buried it. Calm doesn't always mean compassion. Sometimes, it's the scariest kind of exit, one that stays in the room with you. Jenny began to see it differently now. His stillness wasn't anchor-like, it was fog. A smokescreen of composure that made it easy to miss how every decision was postponed into invisibility. The DNA test yanked that fog from her eyes, and suddenly, past arguments didn't look like compromise. They looked like evasion. He didn't lie to her, but he also didn't answer. He didn't tell her no, but he never said yes. That gray area became her emotional home. Comfortable until it wasn't. Until she realized she had been living in a relationship that celebrated her patience and offered very little else. Because if he saw her unraveling, if he loved her as deeply as he always said, why didn't he meet her where she broke? Why didn't he change? Not when it was too late, but when she was blinking through tears, hoping he'd care enough to move. That's what clarity does. It makes you replay moments you thought were normal and ask harder questions. Like, what happens when passive love starts to feel like a slow betrayal? He may not have raised his voice, but the silence was loud. And now, that silence had context, purpose, direction. And none of it was on her side. Not deciding is still a decision, and Sumit's made it over and over. The reply came fast. No dramatic buildup, no delayed tension. Just a message. Simple, measured, composed. I know who you are. I've always known. I'm not angry. I just don't want contact. That was it. No punctuation needed to drive the point home. For Jenny, it didn't hit like a slap. It landed like a brick being set gently but permanently in a wall. Her daughter wasn't missing. She wasn't erased. She had a life. A stable one. A complete one. Just not one that included Jenny. The fantasy vanished instantly. There would be no tearful reunions, no slow, motion airport embraces, no Instagram-worthy new beginnings, but also no cruelty. This wasn't rejection soaked in blame. It was a boundary drawn by someone who had spent her whole life deciding what she needed. Jenny read the message twice, maybe 3 times. She didn't cry. Her hands didn't shake like they did when the envelope first arrived. Because this time, she was prepared. Not for loss exactly, but for autonomy. She knew better now than to demand what someone wasn't offering. And still, the grief came. Not for what could be, but for what never was. For the milestones she missed. For the voice she would never recognize on the phone. For the word mom never meant for her. But this grief had a purpose. It didn't flatten her. It focused her. She didn't spiral into why me. She sat with, now I know. And there's power in that. When someone chooses distance and names it honestly, you don't have to burn your energy interpreting silence. You meet respect with respect, even if it breaks you a little. But while Jenny sat in this brand new clarity, something strange began to surface. Sumit's shoulders loosened. His questions decreased. His energy leaned more into relief than rage. And Jenny noticed, why was the man who claimed he would do anything for her so comforted by the news that no drastic changes were needed? No travel, no reconciliation attempts, no confrontation. This wasn't his pain to carry, but the way he stepped back instead of in told her everything. Maybe he'd never prepared for a version of her that wanted more, not from their life together, but from herself. Clarity didn't rebuild the relationship, it dismantled the lie. Jenny started replaying scenes. Not the big fights. They barely had those. It was the quiet moments, the ones you excuse. The skipped conversations, the shifting deadlines, the wedding talks that turned into not yet, later, eventually. Every time she'd brought something real to the table, Sumit had a way of gently moving it aside. Not with anger, with vagueness. She used to call it cultural difference, timing, even humility. But the problem with soft avoidance is that it still leaves bruises. You just don't notice them until you sit still long enough to touch the same spot twice. All those years, she thought her patience made the relationship stronger, that waiting was proof of depth, that shrinking her needs was generous. A woman in love, willing to be flexible. But now she saw something sharper hiding underneath the niceness. Her silence wasn't a gift, it was a transaction. She had shrunk quietly, systematically, to preserve someone else's comfort. And the trade-off never balanced. Every time she folded, it bought time, but not change. Sumit got to continue at his speed. Jenny bought calm at the cost of her boundaries. Looking at him now, she realized what version of her he had fallen for. The version that asked softly. The version that filled in blanks and waited for implications. The one who didn't press too hard, didn't threaten to leave, didn't make demands. She made space for him constantly and called it love. But now, she wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for clarity. And that version of her, the one with questions, with a timeline, with self-respect, made him uncomfortable. He said the right things, still wanted her close, still smiled like nothing earth-shattering had occurred. But there was an unease in him now, something almost like suspicion, as if he knew she was considering decisions she hadn't dared before. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't yelling. That would have been easier to dismiss. But Jenny was doing something far more dangerous, changing without permission, shifting the weight of the relationship back into her own hands. And not apologizing for it. Sumit didn't look like he was ready. Not for who she'd become, but for the parts of her she'd stopped hiding. If the version of her that waited was lovable, what happens now that she's standing straighter? She wasn't invisible. She was edited for someone else's comfort. And now, she's rewriting it. The shift was subtle at first. Sumit started bringing her tea without asking. He offered to talk about future plans, casually tossing around phrases like, "whenever you're ready." He mentioned timelines again, vague still, but at least they were back in the air. To an outsider, it might have looked like effort, growth, movement. But Jenny could feel the hollowness under it. These weren't new behaviors. These were rehearsals, comfort tactics dressed up as emotional labor. She knew the difference now. He wasn't meeting her where she was. He was trying to pull her back to where she used to be. The version of her that accepted gestures in place of honesty. But Jenny didn't want ease anymore. She wanted the kind of clarity that doesn't flinch. So when Sumit said, "whatever you need, I'm here," she responded, "I need specifics." And that word landed like a thunderclap. She wasn't asking for another cycle of almost decisions. She wasn't asking to be reassured. She was asking for evidence. Actual signs that he was willing to confront discomfort without hiding behind peacekeeping. For the first time, she understood her staying power had nothing to do with devotion. It had been fear. Not fear of losing him, but fear of having nothing else to anchor to if she let go. Now that fear was receding, and what remained wasn't hate. It wasn't regret. It was space. Unfamiliar, open space. Sumit hadn't prepared for this version of her. He knew how to respond to the woman who cried and then apologized for crying. The one who carried both their emotions so he could keep his hands clean. But he didn't know how to respond to Jenny when she didn't rush to make things okay. When she sat in silence and let him feel the weight of it. Where once she craved his voice to fill the void, now she listened for what he wasn't saying. Why is this so hard for you? Why are you still speaking in pause buttons? Because the truth wasn't that she couldn't live without him. It was that she had built too much of her life believing she had no right to want more. That illusion had shattered. So now, the question wasn't whether she'd stay. It was whether staying still made sense. Jenny stopped translating his silence into safety, and the silence got loud. Jenny started searching like someone who's tired of guessing. Not for closure, for proof. She dug through public databases, traced names across counties, pulled up forms that might have once passed across her own trembling hands. Each document told a story someone else had hidden from her. A facility name here, a birth date locked in there. A name she didn't give, but one that belonged to her anyway. There was no shaky reunion call, no dramatic message asking to meet. There was just data, collected, organized, and indifferent to her pain. And for the first time, she wasn't looking for emotional reward. She wasn't hoping to be welcomed in. She was simply refusing to stay out of her own story. That's when it landed. Her life hadn't naturally narrowed. It had been narrowed for her. By systems that told her it was over. By people who said things like, "It's better this way." By relationships that quietly benefited from her believing she had no other path to walk. Sumit tried to keep up. He started speaking in we again. "We can go deeper if you want. We can take our time. We'll figure this out together." But the weight behind those words had changed. Jenny used to hear unity in them. Now they sounded like soft tethers. Not cruel, but not honest either. Because we was never automatic. And this time, she wasn't falling back into default settings where love meant disappearing just a bit more to maintain balance. She wasn't pulling away. She wasn't punishing him. She was updating the map. And this time, the destination wasn't closeness. It was clarity. She realized something powerful. Her identity didn't have to be a reaction to someone else's comfort anymore. It didn't need validation, or permission, or even an outcome. It just needed truth. And when truth arrived without invitation, she let it sit. Didn't chase it, didn't reshape it to fit old patterns. Because it wasn't distance that hurt. It was the way she used to beg for it to close. She's not choosing distance. She's accepting it for the first time. Breakfast still gets made, laundry still folds. From across the room, nothing looks broken. But something's changed in the air, so quiet, it hums. Jenny isn't bracing herself anymore. She's not waiting for the next delay, the next soft promise, the next explanation that deflates mid-sentence. She's not angry, but she's not cushioning the truth either. She hasn't packed a bag. She hasn't delivered some big ultimatum. What she's done is harder to notice and harder to undo. She's rerouted the power structure without ever raising her voice. And Sumit feels it. He starts fidgeting more, filling silences with small talk, watching her more closely as if trying to read a decision she hasn't spoken out loud. She answers when asked. She smiles when necessary, but she doesn't reach anymore, doesn't soothe, doesn't lean in. Jenny doesn't drop hints. She's not trying to test him. She's simply living without the old default, without swallowing herself to stay. This isn't a breakup. This is what happens after the illusion of balance dies. When one person starts telling the truth with their choices instead of their words, and the other has no clue how to respond without losing ground. Sumit still thinks the silence means calm. He used to read her quiet as patience. Now it sounds different, final. Not because she's leaving, but because the invisible thread tying her to timidity just snapped. Where once she moved around him with reflex and instinct, now she moves through space on her terms. She walks into rooms like they're hers again. She doesn't narrate every choice. She exists like someone who no longer believes endurance equals loyalty. Sumit hasn't said much, but his silence feels nervous now. That low-level panic of a man realizing his emotional leverage has expired. He doesn't say, "Don't go," because she hasn't said she's going. Worse, she might stay and still not be within reach. Everything Jenny used to fear, being alone, starting over, not being needed, it's still there. But it doesn't control her. Because now she knows what costs more than starting again. Staying so small you vanish. She's not afraid of emptiness. She's afraid of disappearing again. The real shock was never the DNA. It wasn't the child or the absence of reunion. It was the realization that a single missing truth shaped decades of decisions, silently, effectively, and without her consent. Jenny didn't just lose time. She lost versions of herself she never got to meet. And no one warned her. This isn't some dramatic 90-day twist for ratings. This is what it looks like when a woman stops mistaking survival for closure and finally demands clarity. Quietly, completely, and without apology. The cost? Everything she used to bend to protect. The gain? Herself. Because the story wasn't about a relationship ending. It was about a woman who stopped waiting for someone to choose her before choosing herself. And that brings us here, to a brutal, honest question that every other couple on this show should be asking themselves right now. How do you know when your patience becomes self-abandonment? Up next, why do so many 90-day women confuse patience with power? And when is it time to stop waiting for someone to catch up?